This man, a natural archaeologist, unexpectedly discovered a cave covered with weeds nearby during his exploration. Filled with curiosity, Hopper hurried to the cave entrance to investigate. However, he was surprised to find a person standing motionless inside. No matter how much he called, the figure showed no response. Seeing this, the professor realized something unusual. He immediately called his dog back home, bid farewell to his students, and packed his belongings. Afterward, he returned to the cave. To prepare for potential danger, he placed a rope at the entrance of the cave before leading his dog into the cave. However, as they neared the entrance, the dog refused to proceed further. In a situation with no alternatives, the professor ventured into the cave alone to investigate. Unexpectedly, after taking only a few steps, he noticed the air in front of him starting to ripple. It seemed like an invisible wall was isolating the cave from the outside world. This miraculous scene only piqued the professor's curiosity further. Thus, he proceeded deeper into the cave without much hesitation. Strangely, as he approached the man in the cowboy outfit, the man also began moving slowly. When the professor passed through the invisible barrier, the cowboy suddenly regained normal movement. The professor, seeing this, grew even more suspicious. But since the individual's identity was unknown and they were armed, the professor did not dare to greet him recklessly. Instead, he silently watched as the man disappeared around a nearby corner. Even stranger, since the professor entered the cave, the light outside began to change continuously. Simultaneously, growling sounds echoed from deep within the cave. The professor was so frightened that he didn't dare breathe heavily. Only after hearing a human scream from inside did he realize the place was incredibly dangerous. He fled the cave without looking back. Outside, the scene was even stranger than inside. Though he had only been in the cave for a few minutes, outside, the time had shifted from daytime to late night. Moreover, the dog that had been guarding the entrance had vanished without a trace. The only thing that remained was his car. But as he approached it, he discovered the car had been overtaken by weeds and could no longer start. At first, the professor thought someone was playing a prank on him. However, upon noticing that his work ID had yellowed due to oxidation, he realized that things were far from simple. At this point, the professor didn't have time to ponder deeply. All he wanted was to quickly leave this strange place. On his way back, he noticed an off-road vehicle. Curiously, despite calling out several times, he received no response. When he decided to take the battery from the vehicle for use, he was shocked to discover that the car had been abandoned for years. Even more bizarre, he distinctly remembered not seeing this vehicle when he first arrived. While he was still puzzled about this, his attention was drawn to an old tattered newspaper in the car. On closer inspection, he recognized a bag belonging to Taylor, one of his students. After searching everywhere without success, the professor began to suspect that something dangerous was happening. The only plausible conclusion was that Taylor had also entered the cave. Worried for his students' safety, the professor resolved to courageously return to the cave once again. However, he never anticipated the strange events that would follow. Even more unexpectedly, from the very first time he passed through the invisible barrier, 3 days had already elapsed in the outside world. The professor's disappearance caused Taylor to worry that he was in danger. Thus, Taylor led 4 friends up the mountain to search for him. On their way, they didn't see the professor's car but instead found a childhood family photo of the professor on an abandoned bus. This discovery suggested that the professor had gone up the mountain alone to search for a relative who had mysteriously disappeared there years ago. Finding the photo convinced the group that the professor was still nearby. However, they found no trace of him along the path. As the group pondered, a chubby boy and the team suddenly discovered an old rope tied to the back of a car. Following the rope, they found an empty cave where the rope had snapped at the edge of a cliff inside. Although they didn't know if the professor was trapped below, the 4 decided to venture inside to search for him. Only Furby, because of his cowardice, chose to stay outside to stand guard. Meanwhile, the remaining 4 slowly descended the cliff, following the rope and ventured into the depths of the cave. When they were halfway down, they encountered an invisible barrier. However, since they didn't feel any resistance, they assumed it was a natural phenomenon and continued descending without thinking much of it. As Jackie and Beeves grew excited about exploring the cave, strange roars suddenly echoed from deep inside. At first, both of them were curious about what might be inside. However, human screams reverberating through the cave startled Jackie, prompting her to decide to leave and return to the surface. Unexpectedly, just as she began climbing back, the rope suddenly snapped. Jackie twisted her ankle while Taylor injured his hand trying to catch her. Despite their physical pain, their greatest concern was the cause of the rope breaking. The last rope they had snapped easily with just a slight tug, leading Taylor to suspect Furby of playing a prank. He picked up the walkie-talkie to scold him but received no response, no matter how many times he called. While the group was still confused, The sound of a heavy object falling echoed in the distance, further heightening their fear. Taylor was the first to react. He wasted no time in trying to contact Furby, asking him to throw down another rope. However, what shocked him was that through the walkie-talkie, he heard his own voice echoing from the tunnel ahead. Thinking he misheard, he tried again. This time, Furby's voice calling for help came through the walkie-talkie. Upon hearing this, the entire group was stunned and found it hard to believe. To uncover what was happening, Taylor and the remaining 3 decided to search for Furby. As they ventured deeper into the cave, they noticed that the light from the cave entrance above flickered repeatedly, resembling the cycle of sunrise and sunset. While the group was puzzled, Kara discovered something near the cave entrance. She climbed onto a rock for a better look and realized it was the broken rope. She recognized it as Furby's rope. When Kara instinctively leaned down to investigate further, she was horrified to find Furby's lifeless body at the bottom of the cave. The group was overwhelmed with grief. Looking at the broken rope lying on the ground, Taylor suspected that someone might have intentionally cut the rope while Furby was climbing down. However, this assumption didn't make sense, as Furby was known to be extremely timid. He wouldn't have dared to climb down the cave alone, even in a group, so how could he have done so by himself? Taylor was baffled, unable to comprehend the situation. Fortunately, Furby's body camera was still functioning. Thus, the group decided to seek answers by reviewing the footage. However, the more they watched, the more confused they became. As it turned out, while the 3 of them had only been at the bottom of the cave for a short time, Furby had experienced 7 days outside. During this time, Furby discovered the professor's jeep and the rescue rope set up at the foot of the mountain. He also stumbled upon an old journal from the Middle Ages in an abandoned vehicle. The journal described how the Queen of Spain had sent an expedition to find a cave containing the Fountain of Immortality to cure her husband. However, the group was heavily attacked by cave-dwelling natives, resulting in significant casualties. While a few individuals managed to escape, they didn't find anything and some members mysteriously disappeared. Furby's discoveries didn't stop there. That evening, he climbed into the old vehicle and found the professor's father's journal. From it, he learned that the professor's parents had gone missing in their quest to find the Fountain of Immortality to save their gravely ill daughter. The camera then fast-forwarded 7 days. By this time, Furby had run out of food, while the 4 people who had climbed into the cave still hadn't returned. He had no choice but to accept that they might have encountered a disaster. However, since Taylor's car was a manual transmission that Furby couldn't drive, and walking hundreds of kilometers back home was impractical, Furby could only hope to find the professor's car keys. When he attempted to descend the rope to search for the professor's body, the light at the cave entrance began flickering rapidly. Then, before anyone could react, the rope snapped and Furby plummeted straight to the ground. The horrifying sight was too much for the group to bear, and they stopped the video immediately. However, questions arose. Why had only a few hours in the cave translated to 7 days for Furby outside? Though the cause remained unclear, the group maintained their composure. They realized that these strange phenomena must be connected to the mysterious cave. At this point, the most crucial task for the group was to leave the cave as quickly as possible. However, the rope they previously used had snapped, so they did not dare to use it again. As a result, the only person in the group skilled at climbing, Kara, decided to climb out of the cave alone to seek help from the outside. But as soon as she got outside, Kara was almost terrified by the scene before her. The lush green forest she had seen before had now turned into a desolate wasteland, with the air filled with dust, causing her to cough uncontrollably. What made her even more uncomfortable was that her phone could not receive any signal. Seeing a massive sandstorm approaching quickly, Kara hurriedly climbed to a higher spot to try again to get a signal. However, as she rushed, she suddenly noticed a horrifying sight. A strange triangular structure was hovering in the sky, and the distance between the moon and Earth seemed to have shortened significantly. She could see the numerous craters on the moon's surface clearly with her naked eyes. Terrified, Kara did not dare to linger any longer. She quickly returned to the cave to recount what she had just seen to the 3 remaining group members. However, they did not believe her, as from their perspective, Kara had been outside for less than a minute. With no other options, Kara presented the video she had recorded as evidence. After watching the video, the group was astonished. Taylor used his recording device to verify and discovered that Kara had indeed only been outside for less than a minute. Comparing the data, they realized that time inside the cave passed much slower than outside. The flickering light at the cave entrance was actually the sun rising and setting repeatedly. Thanks to this realization, they understood the time discrepancy with Furby and the reason why the rope had snapped. For every second they climbed, an entire day passed outside. No rope could endure friction against the rock for such an extended period without breaking. The inability to use ropes also meant that apart from Kara, the other 3 had no way of escaping the cave. While the group was still anxious, Taylor noticed something strange. When Furby fell, his walkie-talkie wasn't damaged, yet now it was destroyed. This made Taylor suspect that Furby's death had other underlying causes. The group decided to watch the rest of the video. But the more they watched, the more horrified they became. It turned out that when Furby fell, he did not die immediately, but instead entered a state of unconsciousness. Shortly after, Taylor's call on the walkie-talkie awakened Furby. Furby sent out a distress signal via the walkie-talkie, but before Taylor and the others could arrive, a pair of large feet suddenly appeared in front of the camera. Without saying a word, the figure picked up a rock and struck Furby. This proved that there were other beings in the cave, and they were extremely hostile to outsiders. It didn't end there. Vives examined the video closely and discovered that the sunlight in the footage didn't move from east to west as usual, but instead shifted continuously. After slowing the video down 10 times, she realized that each flicker of sunlight represented a full year of Earth orbiting the sun. From this, they concluded that the few hours they had spent in the cave equated to hundreds of years passing outside. Kara, who had initially planned to climb out for help, now felt utterly disheartened. She expressed doubt as to whether humanity still existed on Earth. Just as she finished speaking, a metal rod emitting a blue light suddenly embedded itself in the ground at the cave entrance. Under the astonished eyes of the group, the metal rod began sprouting branches and eventually formed into a ladder. Before they could react, a humanoid figure appeared at the cave entrance. The figure was 3 meters tall and wore a mask. At that moment, the group could not determine whether it was human. After staring at Taylor's group for a while, the figure remained silent. Suddenly, a wild human appeared and attacked the giant from behind. However, thanks to its physical advantage and advanced technology, the giant easily subdued the wild human and pinned him to the ground. After dealing with the trouble, the giant continued to stare at Taylor's group but still said nothing. Uncertain whether it was a friend or foe, the group decided to flee for safety. However, they did not realize that the real danger was hidden deep within the cave. After traversing a path with dangling stalactites, they were fortunate to find a large open space. However, before they could celebrate, the group discovered a corpse lying on the ground. What was even more terrifying was that the corpse was still warm and seemed to have died less than 2 minutes ago. Jackie, having seen the professor's family photo, quickly recognized the body as that of the professor's mother, who had been missing for 45 years. Not far from there, they also found the body of the professor's father. While the group was still puzzled over the cause of death for the 2 individuals, they suddenly noticed a group of wild humans scavenging the cowboy's corpse nearby. Seeing this, Taylor quickly realized that this group might have been responsible for Furby's death. He signaled the group to quietly retreat into another cave. However, they were still spotted by one of the wild humans. Taylor understood that there was no way to escape from these people and that the only option was to fight head-on. He decided to shield the girls to allow them to retreat, but after only 2 moves, he was knocked unconscious. One of the wild humans then stepped forward and delivered a fatal stab to Taylor, killing him. Meanwhile, Kara and the other 2 took the opportunity to escape into a hidden tunnel. Once the wild humans had moved away, Kara decided to return to find Taylor, only to discover him lying lifeless in a pool of blood. Nearby, a giant being approached the lake, collected some water, and appeared to be leaving. However, perhaps influenced by Kara's cries. He stopped and approached her. The giant gently moved Kara aside before submerging Taylor's body into the lake. Kara was utterly confused by what was happening. Thinking that the giant intended to harm Taylor, she rushed forward to retrieve him. However, the giant used gestures to express goodwill and calm Kara. Before any miracle could occur, the wild humans arrived at the lake, armed with weapons and threatening all 3 of them to leave. Of course, the giant refused to back down. With a single powerful strike, the giant sent the wild human flying backward. At this moment, Taylor regained consciousness. However, he had no idea that the giant had saved his life. Seeing the giant confront the wild humans, Taylor planned to wait until both sides were exhausted before making his escape. Unexpectedly, during the battle, the giant's mask was accidentally knocked off, preventing it from breathing properly. Realizing it didn't have much time left, the giant used advanced technology to pin 2 of the wild humans to the ground before collapsing due to lack of oxygen. Understanding that the giant had genuinely been helping them, Taylor quickly picked up the mask and handed it back to the giant. However, the oxygen supply in the device had run out, and even with the mask, the giant could not survive. Before taking its final breath, the giant activated a holographic projection of human history. Through it, the group learned that 1,000 years had passed since their disappearance. During this time, Earth's environment had deteriorated. Oxygen levels had dropped significantly, and plants and animals had gradually gone extinct. To ensure the survival of the species, humanity had no choice but to board triangular spacecraft. travel at light speed, and migrate to Mars. They would wait for Earth's ecosystem to recover before returning home. This also meant that Taylor and the others had been completely separated from the current human civilization. Faced with this reality, the group felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness and despair. However, Taylor accidentally found the professor's backpack that had been left behind. Remembering their original mission upon entering the cave, he resolved to find the professor before deciding their next steps. To prepare for unforeseen dangers, Taylor took the cowboy's revolver and ventured deeper into the cave. At a crossroads, he discovered several glowing sticks on the ground. It seemed the professor had left them as markers to avoid getting lost. Following the glowing sticks, Taylor continued his search. Unexpectedly, he came across a wild human child holding a leather water bag and carefully moving toward its ailing mother. Looking around, Taylor noticed that the area was filled with wild human corpses, each bearing clear bullet wounds, evidence of a battle between the cowboy and the wild humans. This gave Taylor hope that the professor might still be alive. Deciding to ignore the little girl in front of him, Taylor continued searching. Eventually, he found the professor lying motionless at a bend in the tunnel. No matter how much Taylor called out, the professor simply stared straight ahead. Looking up, Taylor was surprised to see a blue barrier in the middle of the tunnel. Beyond the barrier, he could see a little girl being chased by a group of wild humans. Taylor was confused, but the professor explained that the girl was his younger sister. The professor also revealed that time within the barrier moved much slower than outside. They were witnessing a battle erupt between a medieval army and the wild human tribe. The professor believed that this army was the lost expedition sent by the Queen of Spain. While the battle had occurred hundreds of years ago, within the canyon, it had only just begun. The passage of time inside was so slow it was indescribable. Taylor intended to step in to rescue the professor's sister, but the professor stopped him. He explained that even spending 1 second in the canyon would mean that everyone outside would already have died by the time Taylor returned. The professor emphasized that the only thing they could do now was to leave the cave as quickly as possible. Taylor wanted to bring the professor along, but he had been impaled by a spear in the chest and could no longer move. Meanwhile, the wild humans nearby were gradually recovering thanks to the magical water being poured on them by the wild human girl. Understanding that no one would survive once the wild humans fully recovered, the professor asked Taylor to give him the revolver. The professor decided to use his remaining life to buy time for the group to escape. Taylor reluctantly obeyed and ran into the cave containing the Fountain of Immortality to retrieve the magical water for the professor. However, as soon as Taylor left, the wild humans had fully recovered. The professor decisively fired the gun multiple times, but due to significant blood loss, his vision blurred and all 4 shots missed their targets. Realizing he had no other choice, the professor shouted for Taylor to run. Hearing this, the group didn't hesitate and immediately turned back toward the original exit. However, when they arrived, they found that the shimmering white light at the exit had turned into a static green glow. Although confused, the perilous situation left them no time to think. They decided to use the high-tech ladder left by the giant creature to climb out. But upon nearing the exit, they discovered it was sealed off by a glowing green liquid. Below, the fully recovered wild humans stared up at them like predators, ready to strike at any moment. After careful consideration, Kara gritted her teeth and placed her hand in the water. Unexpectedly, she was forcefully pulled into the water by an unknown creature. Kara struggled and barely managed to resurface. However, just as Taylor grabbed her hand, the wild human leader was distracted by the glowing button on the high-tech ladder. When he pressed the button, Taylor and the others lost their foothold and began to fall. Simultaneously, Kara was pulled entirely into the lake. Strangely, the creature in the water didn't harm Kara but carefully placed a breathing mask on her. In Kara's view, Taylor and the others suddenly froze in place, completely motionless. Moments later, 3 electronic tentacles rapidly appeared, piercing into the cave and binding Taylor and his group at lightning speed. By the time they realized what was happening, they were suspended mid-air by the tentacles. Meanwhile, under the astonished gazes of the wild humans, Kara suddenly reappeared at the cave entrance. She quickly told Taylor's group to hold their breath before pulling each of them into the water. The wild humans watching below were utterly bewildered, their minds on the verge of exploding as they couldn't comprehend what was happening. However, before they could react, the 4 tentacles once again entered the cave, completely ignoring the wild humans. The tentacles began searching every corner of the tunnel as if looking for something. The scene shifted to Furby, who suddenly woke up in the lake. He noticed the strange environment around him and saw Earth outside a window, gradually drifting further away. Furby was utterly confused until he heard the sound of water nearby. Looking closely, he saw 2 enormous creatures standing at the entrance. Strangely, their hands didn't resemble human hands. Just as Furby was still trying to make sense of things, the professor emerged from the water, startling both of them. Taylor and two others also appeared, now wearing new uniforms. Even the professor's parents and sister had been revived by the Fountain of Immortality. However, a difficult question arose. How would the professor's parents react upon learning that their son was now older than them? The giant beings in the cave and aboard the spaceship were, in fact, the result of thousands of years of human evolution. Their next destination was humanity's new home, Mars. Today's story ends here. Thank you for watching. If you find it interesting, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel to support us.